Everyone settle down. We are starting a session soon, so whoever wants to settle down here can do that, and we'll begin in 2 minutes. So we have three people on board and on panel with us, and they all. So one is Osama Siddique. He will introduce himself soon, and the other ones are Muneeza Shamsie, who is a Pakistani writer, critic, literary journalist, bibliographer, and editor. And the third person on the panel is Maniza Naqvi. She's the author of three novels, her most recent being Stay With Me, and she'll elaborate more on her introduction as well. So we'll start now.
Hello. Oh, okay, it is working, yes. Hello, it's great to be here, especially for the launch of Osama's book, Snuffing Out the Moon. I'm just going to say a couple of lines about it, why I think it's a terrific book. It spans centuries of history. It goes from the distant past, from Mohenjodaro, from the present day, and onwards to the future. And there are different sections. In each section, he's got different vivid characters. And it's wonderful the way he links up history and justice and the struggle of mankind for sense himself. It has an enormous scope. And, well, let Maniza say what you think of it, and then he'll talk about it.
I wrote an article for the Herald last February, taking a look at all the literature written by Pakistani authors in English. And I began the article by saying that if there was a prize that Herald would have given for literature, it should have gone to Osama Siddique for Snuffing Out the Moon. Because in my opinion, my humble opinion, also as a writer of novels myself, this is probably the finest fiction, that, in my opinion, that has come out of Pakistan. And the reason I say that is that Osama has taken on the enormous task of interrogating and questioning 5,000 years of history. And he has taken a look at history and then also imagined a future based on that history. That, you know, what has passed is leads us to a certain kind of a future, and he raises within that all these very interesting and relevant questions for the time that we are living in, the moment that we find ourselves in. And while his book is fiction, it moves very closely with our historical facts of this land. And I think, yes, that's the part that I love the most, that he is concerned with the history of this land, the land that we live on and which many of us really don't know about, from Mehergarh to Mohenjodaro to Harappa and Gandhara and Takshila and so forth. We seem to be locked into just maybe one period which has overwhelmed us, because there is so much more volumes written about British history and the British Empire, but not at all the greater civilizations that existed on this very land. So I think that's what that interests me most about this book. But as we have a conversation here, I hope what will come forth is more of the beauty of this book. Osama, could you tell us a little bit more about how you have structured this book and what led you to writing this book?
So, Assalamu alaikum ji. Very kind of you to attend. I am overwhelmed by your kind words about the book, both of you. And I think one really good outcome for me, amongst others, in terms of writing it and publishing it, is that I got to meet both of you. I mean, I knew of you, but it's amazing how discourses and books sort of create opportunities. So by way of introduction, I've had several avatars, maybe failed avatars. I started off as a lawyer on Wall Street and then practiced in Pakistan and then became a legal academic and taught for many years. And now I advise the government on law reform. But I guess there were several levels of discontent as a citizen as well as someone working here with how ahistorical our understanding of things is. So I guess it started with just looking at the laws. We don't seem to appreciate at all the context in which they were introduced, and they seem to be inviolable when you're sort of talking to people. But I think the other dimension is really the fact that I've always prided myself in being a South Asian with at least 9,000 years of known history. And I'm one of those strange children who grew up being fascinated by ruins. So if I had an off Saturday and I was close to a ruin, I'd much rather sort of wander amongst the ruins. I think it's that appeal of the picturesque, this notion that other people lived here and there is no trace, and how mortal everything is. But obviously, as a policy person, as a lawyer, I could not quite create the opportunity to write about Mohenjodaro, right? But I wanted to read about it. And so I thought I should write something which I want to read. And so I think a whole host of political agendas, various memories, nostalgia, motivated me eventually to write this book. And the process really started soon after I lost my father, who I was very close to. And I think it was that existentialist moment also, which forces you to sit down and question everything. And so it happened in a very haphazard way. I mean, I had a method to the madness, but it's really various little jigsaw pieces which I've created and tried to assemble into a mosaic. And there are people who find that it has some order, some story, and there are others who may find it. So I was actually also probably rebelling against conventional notions of structure, conventional notions of telling a story. So yeah, I mean, those were some of the motivations.
So that part you didn't tell us. When we had an organizing session before we came here, and we talked about how we were going to, what Muneeza would say and what I would say and how we would question Osama. But he didn't tell us that part, that the book started being written when his father passed away. And as I was reading the book, I asked you this question, Osama, that you see in it all these different characters, and you can feel that they seem to be emerging from maybe a statue, a figurine, or maybe out of a miniature, or maybe out of a stone relief. It is as if Osama has breathed life and has brought back to life something that's passed away, almost as a consolation that nothing ever really passes away, and that if life has been here in this region, it will always stay with you, right? And you take this book, your characters are so real, and they've lived so long ago, yet they are us, right?
So, no one in Mohenjo-daro could have imagined everything like this. But then the question which still strikes me is that how dissimilar are we? And I think that's a human civilizational question. But it's also just a question you ask. Are we evolving as a people? Were the fundamental motivations which drove people essentially the same? Where are we headed? What's going on? And I pose those several questions, but I try not to do it in too cerebral a fashion, because ultimately I think a book of fiction should be able to tell a story. And the story has to be interesting. I mean, so I don't quite buy the excuse which people who write incredibly boring books have, that look, it's very heavy on the intellectual stuff. I think the entire craft of storytelling is also incredibly important. So I think those questions were very much there. But you're right. I mean, I find a lot of these things quite evocative, and I find it surprising when others don't. But that's how we are. We live in a part of the world where Buddhism was the prevalent religion, and now you have nothing except some crumbling stupas and things like that. And so ages come and ages go. So the way the book is structured is that it has 6 periods. starts in Mohenjodaro. I've chosen the year 2084, before the Common Era, and I go a bit into the future, and I look at six unconnected, non-integuous sort of eras of history. And I try and pose the question whether we have the same motivation. So it's called the Book of Omens, the Book of Loathing, the Book of Ardor, the Book of Descent. So there are 5 books. And I sort of look at these as fundamental human sentiments, apprehension, love, hatred. And I try and see whether these kinds of scenarios emerge in all these ages. So what has really changed about us? I know that politically the institutions have developed. I know there is technology, but have we really changed as people? And what does that tell us about us? We still have pogroms. We still have apartheid. The future doesn't look very good. The past doesn't look that great. There have been so-called epochs of happiness. And I think this is really poignant because in South Asia, there is this huge move to create this notion of the glorious golden past, which is driving us forward, right? Whether it's the Hindutva notion of the glorious past or the Islamic notion. And what do we do when we create those, those kinds of wonderlands? What does that do to our sense of reality? Did they actually exist? And then I think history is a part of us, right? It defines us in so many ways. The way we dress, the technologies we use basically stem from the same. Ruins and archaeology are a part of who we are. I mean, they're still intermingled with our cities, as are artifacts. And in many ways, the future is germinating within us, right? We can have the power to define whether it's going to be a dystopia or not. And even if it's going to be a dystopia, which kind of dystopia? And yet, I think our collective existence, by and large, is incredibly ahistorical, incredibly decontextualized. And so I think those are the things which I also pursue in my academic work, when I critique laws and critique legal systems. But I wanted to have a larger canvas and look at life.
I was actually, because you come, this is a bit like something from your novel, actually. Things buzzing overhead. I was very interested because you've got all these different periods. And in each of them, you've got different characters, and all the characters, and some of them actually have 2 or 3 characters. How did these characters come to you? I mean, we can only discuss a few. I'm sure we can't discuss. Can you tell us? There was Prkaa, I can't even pronounce his name, who was hiding in the trees because he knew the flood was coming. Then there are the thieves in the Mughal times, and there's Billah in our time, the terrorist or whatever, the thief. And the woman who's wronged, and then there's the man who jumps and disappears into what is called the regressives from the future. From this future life, he goes and lives in the jungle rather than live in this mechanized world. Can you tell us how all these characters evolved and what you feel are the links between them?
Sure, thank you. So I have 2 responses. First of all, I think the entire experiment of writing a historical novel taught me that you have multiple categories of historical characters. So Emperor Jahangir makes an appearance in my book, and that's my take on who he is. And I do some research, but obviously I'm speculating. As compared to him, there are characters like these soldiers native sepoys who rebelled at the Miamir cantonment, and very few people know about this episode, and they were summarily executed. Now, we hardly know anything about them, but they are historical characters. And then there are completely fictitious characters. Now, the characters, frankly, have multiple motivations. Some are meant to be caricaturing real people I wanted to mock. Some are really sort of more archetypical figures standing for a certain political sentiment. So one undercurrent of the novel is dissent. It fascinates me when people stand up against the system and dissent, because in many ways we owe human progression to people who stand up against conformism. If there weren't any new ideas and people willing to pay the price for them, we would not have progressed much. So some of them are performing that role. Some are there for a purely political reason. I worked as a policy person, as an academic, as a lawyer for almost 20 years in Pakistan. I've seen how people suffer in the legal system. And I wanted to depict that because as I've discovered recently looking at Urdu literature from the region, कि बहुत कुछ लिखा गया है जो हमें पता नहीं है, मुंशी प्रेमचंद से लेके आज तक, about how the law affects ordinary people. So I think the characters have motivation. My methodology, I don't know how other people work. I've met authors who have the entire novel plotted and then they write it out. I perhaps had 15% of the sense of the blueprint. And I can say that as I sat down every evening to write, in many ways the characters formed themselves. I think that's the closest I've come to what perhaps is the creative process. And this was incredibly different from any other kind of writing I've done before. First of all, I was not worried about footnotes. And it was a remarkably empowering experience to take a character and mold it any which way. And it was at times quite whimsical, I must say.
Really? Okay. I think I can relate to that. I'm also a policy person. So, writing policy and memos and reports and then writing a novel are a completely different and very liberating experience when you don't have to stick to the party line on what you can say and what you can't. And there is an aspect of a very important theme in your novel, Osama, that I think you have the vantage point because of your law background, your policy work in law, that I also share with you in my development work, which is that you have people that one relates to the most, which in your novel are referred to as regressives, right? The people who are the have-nots or the ones from whom uh, their lands and their resources are being stolen, and who really are not benefiting from the technological advance and so-called progress. So you turn the word progress on its head. And can you speak more to that, to this, the whole concept of regressive?
So I guess there are two or three different contestations taking place in my mind when we look at the near future. I mean, there are people who claim to look far into the future. I can't even tell what's going to happen in Lahore next week. So this is a purely speculative exercise. But two or three things,
Vasant.
two or three things which are quite resonant right now. One is the water crisis. So you can well imagine that there are going to be wars in the future on water. The other is the longevity of the nation state as an organizing structure of political power. The third is what social media has done to our discourses, and especially to discourses of hate. It's so much easier now to actually be divisive. You can counter it, but we can see how hate speech has grown and all that. So the kind of future I'm trying to visualize, my speculation is that despite technological progress, the fundamental human tendency to other people, to create one group of people who are somehow, since they are not conformist with the prevalent order, have to be discriminated against is there. Now, the funny thing is that this is a future in which I see pragmatism as being supreme over religion, because people have had a lot of bad experiences with organized religion and wars, and yet what they've done is that they've conflated religion with spirituality. So anything which is metaphysical, anything which is spiritual is now frowned upon. And it could also be just because there's little water and they don't want to share it with everyone. So these people are now dubbed as regressives simply because they don't adhere to this completely secular notion of the future. Now, I'm someone who believes in a secular state. So in many ways, this goes counter to my normal tendencies, right? I talk about the secular constitution and the state being secular in various ways. But I'm also now speculating here whether a state can actually completely ban any notion of spirituality. And what does that do to you? Is that also discriminatory? And also that even with technological progress and pragmatism, is it possible that this fundamental tendency to discriminate against people is still there? We're still illiberal, despite being liberal in some ways. So that's the kind of scenario in which I create some characters, and I try and there are certain events and certain things happen. And I guess there's also this fundamental question of who's telling history, who's writing it, and what is the prevalent notion. I think we're living in a fascinating age. And when I wrote about it, frankly, Trump had not come into power, so alternative facts had not been coined. But we can see how different historical narratives today are trying to hijack the space. And that's always been the case, right? So we know about Jahangir, what Jahangir allowed to be written. Unless somebody wrote something, it was hidden away and we find it. So what happens when it becomes even more organized? In 2084, before Common Era, and after Common Era is frankly coming from Orwell's 1984. Because at the end of the day, I think it's a remarkable book about dystopias, about speech, about curbing speech. Um, so yeah, I mean, so the regressives are these people who are dubbed as backward, non-pragmatic, dogmatic, and so-called spiritual. And it's interesting how when you dub everybody like that, I speculate that the distinction between religions goes away because all of them are being discriminated against. So the devout Hindu, the devout Sikh, and the devout Muslim finds himself or herself in the same situation of being othered.
So, and the regressives are being called regressive because of this one particular resource, right? You want to speak to that a bit?
So I think it's becoming fairly evident now with the climate change and population how water is becoming scarce. And I did some research. A lot of my class fellows from earlier days are now senior sort of executives at all the companies which control water. They give you many reassuring sort of words and all that. But who's accessing the aquifers is going to very much determine who dominates the regions in the future. And so one can speculate that perhaps tomorrow the people who really control the political and economic landscape are the people who control water. And these could be international conglomerates for all that we know. I mean, maybe there won't be an India-Pakistan. Maybe there'll be Nestle. So you can...
Pepsi.
Or Pepsi.
We
or
already
Coke.
have Coke Studio.
Exactly. So I think this corporatization of public resources is a big issue. And already, they're saying that the monsoons this year in the northeast of India have failed. And they fear droughts and sort of famines and all sorts of things. And we are obviously managing water very poorly. We managed to manage it even poorly when we had the sort of entire discourse hijacked by a judge who should have been doing his job. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a very real concern. And we're paying lip service to climate and to water. So in some ways, environment is a big issue, not just because it's fashionable. And there's hardly any discourse.
And so I don't know whether you did that by design. Obviously, well, maybe not. But I kept seeing that all your characters that you had that were sympathetic, that were the heroes in all your periods, were all escaping into the forest. So you had the water issue on one side and them escaping into...
Well, I mean, that kind of it was something you touched on earlier, but if you could expand on it, what is an advanced society? I mean, we perceive it as a technological society. What is and how does that relate to human values? I mean, how does that relate to civilizations of the past, the technological society that we have now compared to the non-technological societies of the past?
So I guess 2 or 3 things which appear to be the running theme in terms of progression or evolution, if there's anything. One is technology. One is political structure. So you start off by the city-states. You go to the satrapies in the Gandharan era. You get to the grand empire under the Mughals. You get to colonial empire, which is even bigger. You get to the nation-state, and then there's the post-nation state. So you could argue that there is definite political evolution of some sort. There is technology. Although at the same time, I'm sort of arguing that the fundamental nature of human engagement, of human perception, motivations are by and large the same. There is still this contestation between technology and religion as organizing principles. And I don't know, I don't have an answer, so I've laid it out and I've kept it vague. I think it remains a recurrent question, but I think the forest is simply because I love trees, but I think it's symbolic. So it's there consciously and subconsciously because in some ways it seems like a very backward step, right? You're going back to the forest. You're going back to the caves. And yet it turns out that the people who are going back to the forest symbolically, metaphorically, or actually are the people who are questioning this mode of progression. They find it ultimately self-defeating. They find it discriminatory in terms of distribution of resources. They find it less healthy. They find it less appreciative of what life is all about. So I think it's both the denuded forests in Pakistan which caused me to highlight the issue, as the fact that this is the common thread between all the dissenters. It's not nature in a purely tree-hugging sense of the word, although I have nothing against that, but it's about ecology, and it's about
survival.
perception and survival.
Yeah.
Well, then let's look at something else. I'm sorry. Justice. Has justice evolved over the years?
So you could argue yes, and yet I sort of show that no, because it comes from this very personalized dispensation of justice. I mean, you have chaos. So you always have the people in the plains and the people in the mountains, kind of a sociological construct, right? So they set up Takshila, and then the white Huns come. And then the white Huns eventually emerge as a civilization, somebody else comes. So you find this early kind of almost Ibn Rushd kind of a dichotomy of how sociology of civilization is there. But yes, there is progression, right? You move towards constitutionalism by the time you get to 2009. I mean, even the colonial battle at one level is a legal battle. But then I'm also sort of having fun questioning law. Is it just a really hegemonic mechanism of now controlling people? Because you categorize people, citizens are supposed to have equal rights, and yet you have caveats, and especially colonial law created so many categories, you know. So the foreigners were being dealt with in a different way, and the natives were being. So it's a big question, right? So you could say that maybe in the 20th century, one big breakthrough for humankind has been these charters of rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, things like that, which were not there, because at the end of the day, you had the writ of the emperor. So you have now discourses within which you actually advocate rights. And yet we know the reality on the ground in terms of how law itself becomes a tool of coercion, a tool of hegemony.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the crises that we are facing globally right now is that corporations have been given the rights of individuals, that they're being treated like an entity, a human entity, right? So, like the Supreme Court ruling in the United States, which gives a corporation the same rights as an individual. And that changes the nature of things, because now you're actually recognizing an imperial empire building with the same rights as a citizen, and amassing to it the same rights as a citizen. So, yeah.
No, so I mean, I think a lot of these things are also fascinating, right? The creation of the artificial person and all that. But I just wanted to say one other thing, because I guess I'm an academic, and the conversation is really interesting and probing, and it comes out as if this is a treatise on politics. So I'll give you a snapshot. Mohenjodaro is about a young man who falls in love with a pretty girl, and there's a bad priest in it. Takshila is about three monks who are not happy with how Buddhism is spreading because it doesn't deal with common people anymore. And then one of them has a bad dream in which they are being invaded by a vicious horde. The Mughal era is about two small-time criminals who think that if Jahangir can grab power, why can't we go and loot some money in Lahore? And there's also one failed poet in it, and one other person who thinks that he can sell rotting lemons and things like that as things of superior power. The colonial period is about a person who tells the dastan and who comes to Lahore, and he's a dissident against the British. It's about a colonial officer who has nightmares, and it is about a bunch of people who rebel against the colonial authority and cross the river Ravi and go to modern day India. The modern times are about a small time criminal called Billa, who's on the run from the police and has a romance on a cell phone with his beloved, which is an interesting side story. And there is Rafia Begum, whose sole property is the subject of litigation, and she's so desperate that she seeks refuge in a graveyard. And it's also about a major lawyer and how he collaborates with the army. And the future is about this group of people who've been isolated, who live in the hills, and this supremely technologically advanced civilization which controls water, which has a couple of citizens who are questioning their identity. So it is a bunch of stories which are connected to each other in multiple ways. But yes, I think all the things we have spoken about are some of the underlying things which permeate it, which at least to me, in my humble opinion, is what literature ought to be doing, right? It should be telling stories which we can relate to as human beings, but it should also be posing questions openly.
And literature should not be put down and condensed into a tweet like you just did. In 140 characters for every.
Well, I've started
chapter.
using Twitter, so.
Yeah, which is sad because Osama has really written a vast book.
It's an amazing book, actually.
It's an amazing
it's
book.
A huge scale.
When you open it up, don't be in a hurry to finish it. Don't be in a hurry to understand everything. Don't be frustrated about, oh, well, why did I, stop? Why did this character stop here? And when do I get to meet this character again? Down, a couple of chapters. Stay with the book, and it will stay with you because you'll be reminded throughout your day, every day. Oh, this seems to resonate with me because it's coming from what I've read in Osama's fiction. I really can't emphasize enough how the world that we're living in that he has shown as a future of where Earth might go. It's already here. It's happening. We do have a water conglomerate happening, as Osama has described it. There is the question that the wars that are going on right now, whether they're in Iraq or in Sudan, are they about oil or are they actually about the water resources? Golan Heights in the West Bank. Golan Heights, why is that so important? Well, that's a water resource. And the biggest thing between Israel and Palestine is Israelis use 4 times as much water than Palestinians do. And they are celebrated for their trickle irrigation. That's bullshit. Excuse me, that's French. But that's nonsense. It's all about water. They say that the invasion of Iraq was really not about the oil in Basra. It was the huge lake sitting in Kirkuk, or somewhere in that region. The huge lake, which is a huge water resource that irrigates both Iran and on this side Iraq and all the way into Israel. So we really cannot overemphasize the importance of this resource and what we are doing to it. We'll all be running to the forest soon. And before we do that, we should be running to the forest with Osama's characters.
I just want to say one more thing. I love the attention to detail in this book. The way he describes the flowers, the trees, the moonlight, bricks, buildings, spires. He's got everything. And so one very vivid image that haunts me is that in the beginning, the Mohenjodaro, he's actually got a girl who stands in the position of the dancing girl. And later there's a story about what the dancing girl statue that we see. But it's this kind of honing in on details that makes this narrative so alive.
Could you quickly get to that chapter?
Have we got time?
Because thinking of the... okay. Okay. Yes, I agree, Maniza. There are moments in this novel that are so beautiful. The gift that Prkaa gives to this, love of his life. I won't give it away what that gift is. You have to read this book to see what an ephemeral, ethereal gift he gives to this woman that he's in love with, one of the characters. And that image will stay with me for a very long time. I think that Maniza is also referring to that maybe. This one.
What can I say? Thank you.
I think so. We should wind up. I think it's about.
Thank you so much. I guess the biggest boon for a writer is that if you're able to find readers who have actually engaged with it, who actually explored the vistas, and oftentimes I have this incredibly pleasant experience where someone gives me an insight or someone reads language which is ultimately open textured in a certain way or finds a nuance. And I think that's what keeps books going, and that's what keeps us going, because writing, as those of us who write know, is an incredibly lonely and incredibly at times seemingly pointless exercise, right?
How could you have been lonely? You've got how many characters do you have?
Well, those are there, but when you start talking to yourself, people in the family get worried. So you do need human interaction. But I think one other sort of small little thing which is very close to my heart, which is what I've done after the book came out, is that I think we all realize the incredible crisis we face in terms of the younger generation, or at least our perception is that they don't read as much. I mean, and for a lot of people, it's simply affordability, right? But I think we don't put a premium on writing and things like that. So one of the things which I've enjoyed the most is, and very heartening is, that I got invited to a lot of universities. And especially I was very excited to go to public sector universities or the lesser known private universities. And I was overwhelmed. I mean, it really energized me because, look, in my everyday life, I deal with judges and lawyers. So you can imagine how invigorating that must be. But meeting these younger faculty members, graduate students, and them asking really perceptive questions or engaging with the book or making interesting connections with history, politics, and literature, that gives me hope that there is a huge underexplored sort of potential out there in terms of readership and discourses. And frankly, we don't have a choice. I mean, if you want to really salvage the situation, we have to deepen the discourse, we have to broaden it, we have to make books primary rather than, television programs play a role, but I think far too much of our discourse is sort of hijacked by relatively inane bickering over what one politician said or the other. And we need to really sort of now start talking about ideas in books. And so in that sense, I can only make a humble contribution in terms of one other book being part of a vast sort of reservoir. But I think we all need to play this role to constantly promote reading and books. And that's what this is all about.
Are you writing another novel?
I am.
We'll look forward to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, let's go. Mike, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
I didn't realize we didn't have time. Please go ahead.
We're bringing a mic. We're bringing a mic too.
The way you have divided your book into chapters, you're taking a historical perspective, but is it a critique of power? Because, like in Foucauldian terms also, we talk about, history not really helping us understand how power was exercised. So are you really critiquing power or the manifestation of it through these periods?
I think Foucault is very much there, has to be. Foucault is someone I teach. My own sort of analysis of colonial legal project is also one sort of aspect of his very Foucauldian. I think this entire sort of tendency to classify, to categorize, to normalize, to divide is there, right? So, that's where I ask the question, are we evolving? Are we really changing fundamentally? And I guess the question is also there, can we? So one thing which I deal with here, apart from power, is also the notion of evil, which fascinates me, right? So there's the external notion of the Satan, there's the Satan within. And my Buddhist period sort of narrative deals a lot with that because I got fascinated as I started reading about Mara and all these other notions of evil and temptation in Buddhism. And I think it's a fundamental question because I've tried to pose, without giving too much away, some examples of there being evil without any justification whatsoever. And that's something which bothers me. There are latest studies which are saying that you can detect as early as in a child, 2 to 3 year old, psychopathic tendencies, right? So that what happens then? What happened to innocence? What's destiny? If there are people who are going to be inclined in a certain anti-social way, that throws everything out of the window in terms of how we classify good and evil, right?
So you do agree with Foucault that history doesn't help in understanding the manifestations of power?
So the biggest challenge there, I'm sort of slightly propounding a different thing because we are so ahistorical that we haven't even graduated to that stage where we are asking that question. We don't even know things which happened. We seem to welcome every military dictator. That's our knowledge of history. So I think we need to get attuned to history first of all, but then there's a larger philosophical question. History is also problematic also because who's writing it? And that's a question I pose. So, I'm actually speculating here how future history is being written, which will very much depict us as certain kinds of people or certain kind of era. So history writing has so much to do with power that's where I agree with Foucault. But at another level, ahistoricity is a different and separate problem, which needs to be addressed, right?
I think that's a whole different session. Yeah. We have a question here.
Hello, my name is Fatma Siraj, and my question is that you briefly mentioned your interest in the ruins, and it's almost impossible to ignore the myriad of mounds that are lined in Sindh and Balochistan, and when you go there, there are pottery shards that complain of an existence long forgotten. They seem to be neglected, abandoned sites. At the same time, when you go and speak to the local villages surrounding the mounds, there's a mythological landscape that surrounds it, and we can see how there's a socio-political almost which is ignored, and it's guiding their spiritual and everyday life. And I just wanted to know your perspective on how do you think it tells us more about the modern man, and if so, what does it tell about us and the way that modernity has affected these places and our interaction with them?
So that's a good question, and various facets to it. I'll try and be brief. I mean, modernity is so many different things depending on where you're looking at, right? So there are modern states these days who really preserve and catalog everything about history. How they interpret it is, of course, a political process, and there's variation. But I think you raise another important point, which is about mythology, which is another good example of how history lives through us, right? So how we define ourselves, what our aims and goals in life are, how we judge human actions, is very much also by the mythology of a place. So history does not just travel through written documentation or artifacts; it's also the stories which have been built around them. And yes, it tells a lot about who we are and how we are evolving. And to the extent that we also ignore that, one very sort of fundamental characteristic of a lot of human civilizations is that they think they're unique. They're facing certain predicaments for the very first time. Either that, or that they are the anointed ones. They're special. So the big story is that there have been lots of special people before, and we don't even have a pottery shard to tell us about them. So that sense of omnipotence which human beings have. And at the same time, I'm also fascinated by this human spirit, because if we did not have this sense of being able to conquer everything, we would not have planes flying overhead. So it's a very complex existence, right? How do you strike a balance between humility, perspective, learning from history, and at the same time, how do you think also that we are in God's image and we can do things which no one has done before? What will happen tomorrow? Blade Runner in popular culture is a very good example, and it intrigues me, of when human beings create non-human entities which are sentient. What kind of moral dilemmas arise then? Already, I think you asked this question earlier, modernity about cloning, about genetic manipulation, about controlling what kind of children are born tomorrow, are raising questions which are completely unique today. So in some ways, yes, we are changing. And in some ways, we are exactly the same pathetic lot that we've always been.
Well, I think we
On
should.
that very happy note, so we can just say, go and get the book, read it for yourself, and we'll see what we mean.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think it's a good conversation. We should try and get this recording.
It is being recorded, I think.
One,